All right, so I think we will go ahead and get started. It's 2 o'clock. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the first class. I'm so excited to see you. My name is Joy Mayer, and I'm the director of Trusting News. I don't know that we're going to take time to go around and do like actual introductions today. We'll rely on Slack for that because it could take a while. But I'm excited to see you, and I know there were several people who had news come up or kids having surgery or board meetings happening. So I know there's a contingent of class that will be catching up with the recording. We will always record these for the 2 live classes. We'll record them and share them after the fact for people who either want to watch it again or share it with colleagues or just couldn't make it live. We also have 2 class members who are in Australia and said they were going to get up in the middle of the night to watch. And I was like, no, that's okay. So hello to them watching later tomorrow. So let's, I want to be cognizant of your time and not keep you for more than an hour. What we're going to do today is just introduce you a little bit to the problem of trust and why we're investing so much into this and why what you told us were your biggest roadblocks to trust, that we had a good time reading through your assignments last night, and share some kind of top level strategies and talk about how the class will be structured. So I want Erica and I to introduce each other since we're your primary instructors here. My name is Joy, and I started Trusting News in 2016. I taught at the Missouri School of Journalism, just down the road from Nicole, for 12 years and started teaching audience engagement there in 2010, I think. So my work has focused on audience for a while, but this focus on trust is new as of 2016. I taught design, print design and web design first, and then audience engagement. So I work out of a home office in Sarasota, Florida, and Trusting News is my main gig. I'm also the community manager for a platform called Gather that is a community for engaged journalists. And I'm happy to tell you more about that too if you are interested. Erica, why don't you introduce yourself?
Yeah, so I'm Erica Smith. I'm a senior editor at the Virginian Pilot in Norfolk, Virginia. It's a very sunny day here today, which is very awesome. We started working with Trusting News in January, I think, of 2018. And since then, I've signed on and become a trust coach with the organization. So I get to talk to different reporters and editors and publishers and all kinds of different people and kind of work through different issues of trust that they're facing right now. So this is kind of a next extension of that in some ways, but it's been a ton of fun and I've learned a lot, quite honestly, throughout the whole process.
Awesome. So Eric and I are going to teach together, and a couple of you are also assigned to work primarily with Tim Lambert, who is the morning edition host at WITF in Pennsylvania, but he is in Iceland right now, so he gets a pass on the first week, and he'll be back next week to catch up with you. But you can ask questions of any of us if you have them. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Can you guys see that?
Yep.
Okay, I should quit Slack, eh? There we go. Okay, and I think if I do this, you guys can still see it. Can you still see it? Okay, so I did mute people who had not already muted just because the ambient noise of newsrooms and dogs and all that can get in the way, but do feel free to unmute yourself if you have something you want to jump in with. And I can only, once I'm sharing my screen like this, I can only see a handful of you at a time rather than the nice big Brady Bunch grid. So do Erica holler if you see a question or something in the chat that you want to interrupt me with, and otherwise I'm just going to show some slides and talk at you for a bit, okay?
Cool.
So we already introduced ourselves. We are super accessible in Slack DMs. Here are our email addresses, and easy to find us on Twitter as well, so please do just get in touch if you need us. So I don't want to overwhelm you with research, and I have a whole slide deck for research on trust that I will share on Slack. Let me make a note to do that. But I do want to start with just some like top level things we know about trust. So we know that trust in media is not a new distrust in media is not a new problem. It's been going down since a few years after Watergate in the 70s. Trust in institutions is down in general, but the trust in media, if you look at that steep decline in the 80s and you think about the rise of cable news and talk radio, deregulation and what that meant for, just like expectations of fairness for news in general, like this has been going down for a while. It's not just a digital journalism problem. It's not even just a Trump problem, although there's no question that having leadership that constantly calls us the enemy of the people does not reinforce the idea that we are an important public service. So there's no doubt that the problem has gotten worse. You'll notice at the end of the chart here that it has started to go back up a little bit. I have some theories about that, like about people who are inclined to support us, supporting us more strongly. But it is interesting to think about whether we're on an uptick. It's too soon to tell. I already covered that. Okay, so there's a partisan divide, which we know. It's pretty stark and pretty consistent. This, again, the idea that people who identify as Democrats are more likely to trust than independents, who are more likely to trust than Republicans. This is not a new idea either. It's been that way for a while. Also troubling is the generational divide. The idea that younger generations are just less likely to say that they have a fair amount or a great deal of trust in the news. Maybe these people will trust as they get older, maybe they will not, but it certainly is something we need to be paying attention to. The source for all of that data, by the way, is Gallup. They've asked that question of how much trust do you have in media since the 70s, and what they're looking for is people who say it's a fair amount or a great deal of trust. One thing we try to keep in mind at Trusting News is that trust involves elements of both head and heart. So cognitive trust is something journalists tend to feel pretty comfortable with because it's based in facts. We feel like we should be able to persuade people to trust us. There are facts we want to share about ourselves that make us trustworthy, and we would like to talk people in, share enough evidence that people will trust us. The important thing to remember, and that certainly people who run like marketing for brands and stuff, is that effective trust is also really important. That's personal affinity. That's how do I feel about you and how do you make me feel? Do I have a sense that you're trustworthy, think about how this plays out on an interpersonal level. Do I feel like you're reliable and that you're respectful? And so trust involves both elements, and that can be, it's important to remember as we think about strategies for earning trust, that we don't need to just put facts out. It's not enough to put facts out about ourselves and hope people trust us. We have to actually care whether they feel like they can trust us. So here are some things that we heard from you guys. Some of these are direct quotes and some are paraphrases. But here are some things, as Eric and I were going through your assignments last night, that we found some common themes in what you told us gets in the way of your own trust. The difference between news and editorial is so huge. We feel like this is pretty clear in print. Not at all clear in like cable news. When I turn on the TV, I can't tell who's talking and whether their goal is to persuade or inform me. Digitally, it's all over the place. Like that little kicker that's above a headline. Do people even see that? The label that says it's a column, does that travel when the story goes in your app or when it shows up on a social post? There are a lot of ways that we make it difficult for people to tell what's news and what's opinion. And I have to tell you, on the list of things people say they want from news, balance and fairness are at the top of the list. And this idea of the blending of news and opinion is a huge, huge problem. So I think that partly it's completely valid to wish that people paid more attention and were just more like literate about how news works. And the fact that this comes from somebody who's paid to share their opinions versus somebody who's shared to give you information. But fundamentally, even we can wish that people understood this and understood how different departments and job titles work within journalism. But if they don't understand, there's nobody coming in behind us to fix that. There's nobody else who's going to explain it to them. So if we want them to understand it, we have to actually tell them. That's kind of a theme you'll hear us share a lot here. Several of you actually mentioned wire content, syndicated content, and how people feel about national content that you share. Some of you produce national content, but for those of you who publish local content primarily, if you run content from like CNN on your TV website or from AP or the Washington Post, people have very strong opinions about what that signals and also about a perceived bias within that content. And it's really important to know that if we're sharing that with our audiences, we stand behind it and we are selecting it because we find it credible. And it's valid for people to come at us with questions about content that we share for them. They don't much care whether it was reported in our newsrooms. So we need to find better ways to talk about what we share from wire services, why we find it credible and how that works and how we can accept feedback about it. Man, several of you mentioned money and the paywall and why journalism costs money. And this is ripe for a lot of conversation. I have many, many thoughts about it. And we've done a lot of work on this at Trusting News. Frankly, explaining to people who live in a world where a lot of information is free, why your information is not free, like that's a valid conversation, and it's valid for people to have questions. Why is it worth it to give you money? And I think that we have to start this by thinking about what we actually offer people that is worthy of money. There are a lot of ways to come at the paywall conversation. I said to a couple of you in comments last night that my favorite way is to start by saying, like, you hit our paywall, that must mean you find value in our content because you've read 10 things for free this month. So, you know, if you're financially able, can you chip in? Reminding people that you're a local business too, that that you contribute to the local economy and pay local staff members and all those things. There are a lot of ways to respond, but fundamentally, if you don't participate in this conversation, then you're ceding the conversation to the people who are complaining, and not using it as a chance to educate people about what value you offer and why you cost money. A couple of you talked a lot about the relationship between you and your parent company. This is one saying, people think of it as something between a franchise and a big box store. The storefront may be local and the people working in it might be locals, but the decisions about what's done with the store are made by the parent company far away. The struggle's real, man. I totally hear you on this. I think that telling that story about what decisions are made locally is important. People really do assume that whoever owns you uses you for their political and financial gain and are telling you what to publish. So if you have a chance to say, you know, to talk about independence and news decisions and what decisions you get to make, I think there might be a story to be told there, and just inviting people to know who you are so that when they picture your newsroom, they're actually picturing human beings, not a corporate logo. It's tough. A few other things that came up. A couple of you are having some pretty serious customer service complaints, like websites that don't work, newspapers that don't arrive, really confusing, and sometimes subscription options that sometimes feel like trickery, like, why did I get offered this discount? But if I go to your website, it's even cheaper. So that's super troubling and hard to deal with. Shrinking staffs, like when your newsroom notices that you have fewer people and are doing less, how do you address that? Perceptions about sort of motivation and integrity of journalism. One of you said, we'll do anything to get a story, even if it hurts someone. I shared in the Slack this week a column from the Corpus Christi Caller-Times about what it means to be a watchdog, and like how you explain to people, here's why we watch out for the health of our community. And that sometimes means catching people doing wrong things, but it's not our goal to catch people doing wrong things. If we're not talking about what motivates our work, then there's no reason that people should understand it. And then for sure, we don't reflect the diversity of our community. This is a real, it's a valid complaint that a lot of communities have, that, you know, you're not for me. Why should I trust you? Because you're not produced by or produced for people like me, whether that's a certain part of town, certain race or ethnicity, certain class, certain political leanings. A lot of people just aren't seeing themselves reflected in the news. So here's a link to this deck on the bottom that's specifically about research, just a little bit about Trusting News and what we do here. I need to update this. We have more newsroom partners than that. But basically, we run experiments with newsrooms to see how our trust strategies work and how newsrooms respond to them and how audiences respond to them. A few of you are from newsrooms that we've worked with. I appreciate that. We have done some academic research I will tell you about, to do with transparency and how that affects perceptions of credibility. We have done survey and interview work to understand how people decide what to trust. And we write about that on Medium, and we also write about it in our newsletter, which I'll make sure you have a link to. So the 7 sort of basic strategies that we tend to work with are these. Try to differentiate yourself from the media. You know, our goal here with Trusting News is not to defend an entire industry. It's important to remember that irresponsible things are done in the name of journalism all the time. And that when people complain about a clickbait, or about trying to make people look stupid, or about the blurring of opinion in news, or about money influencing news coverage, like all of those things are sometimes true. Our goal is not to say that's not what journalism does. Our goal is to say, if you are a responsible, mission-driven, ethical journalist, here is how you differentiate yourself. Here is how you explain to people why you're credible. 2, we talk about describing your ethics and your funding. What ethical principles guide your work and how are people supposed to know that instead of automatically giving you credit for it. We're going to talk about explaining the process of your reporting, how you make decisions overall and with specific stories. We work on labeling of stories, especially news and opinion, but also like letting people know when you have a fact check or an investigation. We talk about demonstrating balance. Balance is a really tricky word that tends to make journalists uncomfortable. They tend to picture like giving people equal airtime or, you know, interviewing climate deniers or something. This is a word that news consumers use. I'm really eager to do some more research to figure out what they mean by that. I tend to think it's more fairness, like being open-minded to different viewpoints, I think is what they mean. Going where the facts take you, you know, shedding your preconceived ideas, that sort of thing. But we know that demonstrating balance is, there are ways that journalists can even just say that they work to be fair, say that they, like this story might go deep into this perspective, but last week we brought you this other perspective, and not assuming that everyone will give you credit for the full breadth of your balanced coverage. Showing individual personality and credibility is about what we share about ourselves as journalists and how we invite people to find us personally credible. And then being accessible and responsive is really about basic engagement strategies, like showing you're listening, responding to people when they ask you questions, actively inviting feedback, and responding and showing how you're using that feedback. So on our website, we'll throughout the class share some examples, but we have a database of examples of what our newsrooms have tried, and you can sort it according to specific issues. So if you want to see examples that specifically relate to bias and fairness, you can sort the database according to that. We are, by the way, going to give you these slides too, not just the videos, so you can grab these links and revisit any of the examples that you want. So let's go over just some more about the Trusted News philosophy. We have to accept first that there's a huge disconnect between what we think we're doing and what the public is doing. The public is actually pretty divided on whether journalism protects democracy or hurts democracy, which is just like a dagger to the heart. But it's true, and that's what people think, so we can face it. We can wish it weren't true, or we can face it and figure out what to do about it. Because again, no one's going to solve the problem but us, and we do not automatically get credit for our good intentions or for decisions we make that are internal, that are invisible to the public, or for just being good humans. None of those things matter if people can't see them. So as we talk about, I know that some of you guys are really struggling with the constant negative feedback loop and how to respond and moderate, how to respond to and moderate conversations and comments. I want to give you permission not to respond to anybody, just in case, not to respond to everybody in case that's something you're struggling with. There are definitely people who are not worth responding to. We're going to talk in depth in one of the next 2 classes about approaches to comment moderation, but do just remember that some people will not find you credible no matter what. There are people who think that everything the mainstream media does is made up, is invented, is wrong, is driven by politics, and you're not going to say anything back to them that's going to change their mind. So just accept that. Our focus with Trusting News is not to persuade them. We might get there someday. That would be great if we solved everybody else and could just focus on converting the most harsh skeptics. Basically, we focus on the people who are reasonable. We focus on the people who are confused about the media landscape and need some help choosing credible information. We focus on people who do believe in facts, even if we don't always agree about what those facts are. And we also focus on our fans, the people who really love us, because when we talk about what we do, we give them language to talk about and defend our work as well. So let's look at some examples of what we hope you guys will do to address the problem. First, take this back to your newsroom friends. Earning trust is the job of every journalist. No matter what you do, there are things you can do to earn trust. And I know that within this group, we have people in a lot of different roles with different levels of agency and authority in the newsrooms, different types of outputs and products, definitely different size and scale newsrooms, but no matter where you are, you do have a relationship with your audience, and there are things you can do to improve it. Then we basically work to understand the mistrust, which is what your first assignment was about. What causes mistrust? What are the roadblocks and obstacles to a more trusted relationship? Within that, we're going to try to find misassumptions, things people really don't understand about journalism. And then we're going to work at how to tell a better story about our journalism. What do we wish people knew? What do we think will help them find us credible? We have to do these things on 2 levels. And you might come at this from one of these levels. One of these might be more applicable to your role in the newsroom. We have to come at it institutionally. Like, do we publish our ethics and policies? Do we have a mission statement that's good? What is sort of the story we tell about our values and what we stand for and what value we offer our community? How are we committed to describing our paywall or our donation system? And then day to day with individual stories and products, what do we communicate about our processes and how we make decisions? How our ethics influence those decisions? How do we make decisions? Who's behind the news? That sort of thing. So understanding mistrust, again, this is something you guys, we threw you in with this question. What do people misunderstand? What makes them mad? Understanding mistrust. Remembering, of course, that mistrust and skepticism are sometimes valid. I use the word skepticism on purpose because I find it really odd that journalists are often professional skeptics and expect an extreme level of transparency from the people we cover, yet get super bristly and shut down when people expect it of us. We assume the worst. Sometimes we have to assume the worst about the people we cover because we're on the lookout for wrongdoing, and yet we don't understand why that same lens is turned on us. And there are plenty of things within the industry, like don't tell me you don't ever want to like throw a shoe at the TV or like crumple a paper up and throw it away when you see things that other journalists do that cause, or that your own newsroom does, that cause you to just groan. The skepticism is valid. So I mentioned that we have done interviews about how people decide what news to trust. When we partnered with an academic researcher to look for themes in these like 80-something in-depth interviews, what are the topics that people said separated good journalism from bad? Here is their list. Balance is at the top, which I already talked about is complicated and problematic, but really valid to understand that this wasn't like a checklist of things people check, like, yes, I care about balance. It's that within their open-ended answers, these are the themes. So in some way, 77.8% of them talked about that idea of balance. Honesty, depth, man, people actually do want, they say that they want like news that goes beyond quick answers to help them understand the world. Reader agency, which is the word we use to describe like, help me live my life and help me make up my own mind, like give me information that empowers me to live my life. So these are things, when you look at a list like this, they're not things that journalists disagree with. They're things that you look at and say, of course, that's what we aspire to do. Of course, that's what good journalism is. But way too many people don't think they're getting it. And so a lot of what we'll talk about is kind of how to describe what you're giving people and help them understand that they should want you to exist, they should rely on you, and that your information is credible. So when we talk about the misassumptions our audiences have about us, it's kind of funny. Like, I think there's a drinking game embedded in here somewhere. Like, which of these have you heard? Because I mean, it can be sort of comical, but also super depressing to make this list. But it's worth thinking about. Okay, so these are things people actually think. There's money involved in sourcing for sure. Do you know my dad said this to me recently? I was interviewed by a national magazine for something, and he said, "Oh, I hope they paid you for your time." I was like, "No, Dad, that's not how this works." And he's like he consumes a lot of news. We talk about how the news works. He's more educated than the average person. And he was thinking they should have paid me for my time to be a source. You actively suppress information you don't agree with and choose stories that validate your own opinions. This is like scary high percentages of people believe some version of this. Money drives news decisions. You guys, one of the things that I have been most surprised about is the extent to which people assume money is involved in journalism, that corporate ownership is involved, that we make decisions based on financial success, which of course, on some level that's true because we're businesses, right? But the idea that it's like greed is very, very interesting to think about. use sensationalized stories to get clicks or ratings or money. Also, they think that we're personally benefiting. Like if I put a crazy headline on my story that makes you click, I'm going to get a bigger paycheck. Which again, like plenty of places that individual reporters get bonuses or at least performance reviews based on traffic to their stories. So like some of these things have truth in them. You don't really care about getting it right. God, that one hurts, but we hear it a lot. And you're just out to catch people looking dumb or doing something wrong.
Joy, we had a new one pop up this week that I thought was really interesting, and I hadn't heard it before, but others had. Okay. But we had a tertiary character into a story. This is about a high school field hockey coach, and she called us out and said that you didn't have my permission to run my name, so you can't do that. I had never heard that before, but we're still trying to figure out, like, how do we address that in a bigger picture?
Wait, so she was just mentioned, she was not interviewed for a story, but she was mentioned?
Yeah, we mentioned that she had a job as the coach for 2 weeks and then she left and nobody would tell us why. So we just left it. She left. Yeah, she took it very personally.
And paid by, she worked at a school, so she was like paid by the government?
She's a public employee, yeah. So it's these new ones will pop up all the time.
Yeah.
You're going to come up with dozens of other ones too.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing is that, like, just from an audience engagement perspective, like trying to put yourself in their shoes, like I've been talking to folks recently about unpublishing stories.
Yeah.
And that's a really complicated question. Like on the one level, no, of course we don't. Imagine if everybody who called up and said, I look really bad in that photo, you should take it down. Like obviously we can't comply with all those requests, but I also have taken calls from people who said, I didn't realize my kids' names were going to be online when I let you take that photo. And there's somebody in their life who I really need not to find them. I mean, there are often reasons that people don't want to be thrust into public conversation. But yeah, that's interesting. Like people don't know that though. Like, yes, if you're in a public place, we could take your picture. That's how that goes. People don't know. So the more we answer those questions publicly, the more we have an opportunity to educate people about what we're doing. So a lot of you cover local journalism and have a real opportunity to say like, here's what we do. It's interesting when you ask people, there's a story I love to tell about, when I moved back to Florida a few years ago, and I was getting to know my neighbor, we became Facebook friends. And she said to me one day, I'm really excited to be getting to know you because I don't really know any journalists. And I thought journalists were just ambulance chasers and something else. Like she had a really negative impression of who journalists were. And then she went, which is sad. And then she went on to tell a story about how she had made this huge decision. She's an artist and she's a weaver. She had bought this huge loom to put in her dining room because of a story she saw on the cover of the art section of the local paper. But like when she thought about journalism, she wasn't thinking about the profile of the artist on the cover of the art section of the paper. She thought of journalism as crime coverage and politics coverage, basically. So it's like changing this story about what we do and telling a broader story of what we do can be key to understanding what value we bring. So to that end, like think about what you do better than anybody else and what you really offer. What do people turn to you for? And sometimes it will be crime and politics. And in that case, what is your approach to covering crime and politics? But also like just looking for opportunities to say, what do you mean by fake news? I'm sure some of you guys or your colleagues like are getting stopped out in the community and people like accusing you of being part of this fake news climate. And I think it's important that we try to change that narrative if we can. So one way, let's look at some examples from our partner newsrooms. One way that we've had some newsrooms address this issue of like telling a better story about the breadth of your coverage is by creating some social threads that round up your best work. So this is something the Coloradoan did for Colorado Journalism Week. I wish newsrooms would do this once a week or at least once a month. Just ask everyone into the newsroom to share something that they've done lately that they're especially proud of. Or maybe share, like maybe you just get to decide what those top stories are, but think about the breadth of like, we profiled these Medicaid patients and told the story of this veteran's funeral and like took you inside a classroom at the elementary school, like whatever it is that you do, think about how you could pull those together. Maybe it's a newsletter you send out. Maybe you dedicate an edition of a specific newsletter once a month to rounding these stories up. Or maybe it's a social post, or maybe it's just a column from your editor or something, but I think that's a nice habit to get into. So experiments from newsrooms. Also from the Coloradoan, Jennifer Hefty is someone who's worked with us for a while there, and she found herself, they were investing during their work with us, they were investing really heavily on their comment engagement and actually responding to comments and asking questions. Jennifer noticed that she was answering the same questions over and over. Some were story specific, but a lot of them were just like, here's how we decide what crimes to cover and when we run mugshots and when we don't, when we follow up on arrests and when we don't. So she created a story page, how the Coloradoan reports on crime, and now has something that she can link back to every time somebody has a question. So this is partly, it's a great example of how listening well to what your community wants to know can be fodder for what transparency and storytelling are most needed. The other thing the Coloradoan has been really focused on the last year or two is paywalls and subscriptions and driving subscriptions. So they made a decision that they were not going to let people tell other people in comments how to get around the paywall or copy and paste whole stories into comments, that was theft, and that they were going to be aggressive about explaining to people how their paywall worked and why they had it. As a result of a lot of comment engagement, they started to see people standing up for them and answering so that they didn't have to. So like, here's a reader saying, you should read stories based on donations, like a minimum of $5. And somebody else, another reader says, do you get paid to work? Or is it a donation based, like a $5 minimum for your efforts? Which I just love. But if you talk about it publicly, you're giving language to your fans to help defend you. The other thing they've been doing at the Coloradoan is just lately is they did some math and figured out how many digital subscriptions they needed to continue to thrive. And they got their newsroom on board with asking for money, basically. And they had individual reporters write statements about why they're journalists. And these bios run at the bottom of stories. And they're actually tracking which reporters and which subscription asks are the most effective. As part of that, they also decided to be completely transparent about where their funding comes from. I don't know about you guys, but they were getting a lot of questions about like, don't you have advertising? Why do you need money from readers? And so they created this promo spot that says 60% of our revenue is from advertising and 40% is from subscriptions. So they can say, you actually matter. Like whether or not you subscribe matters to our bottom line. So I know that not every newsroom or company is willing to be this transparent. The Coloradoan is a USA Today paper, and they decided, they didn't ask permission first, they just decided to do this. And now that it's working, subscriptions are actually up. I think that it's okay, but they just decided to ask forgiveness, not permission, I think. Sometimes, you know what, in addition to money, another huge thing that readers have or viewers and listeners have a ton of questions about is story selection. There are so many assumptions and questions about how we decide what to cover. And journalists aren't great at talking about it, partly because this is not an exact science. Like we don't have a rubric that says what's newsworthy and what's not newsworthy. And way too often it depends on what our editors drive by on the way to work and happen to notice, or who called in sick and how many editors you have each day or whatever. So I think that it's important when we can to describe that story selection process. This is one where a TV station in Iowa actually wrote about when they decide to cover threats against schools. When is there a threat to public safety? Why we're concerned about copycats? Why when other media are reporting every threat to a school, we're not always going to jump on the bandwagon and how we decide. So I think that's really, it's really good to take time for that when you can and pull back the curtain in that way. Because when we don't tell people how we make those decisions, they're not giving us the benefit of the doubt. All those assumptions people have about journalism, that's how they think we decide what to cover. It's uncomfortable sometimes to say publicly how we decide what to cover because we're worried about it'll turn into a policy. We're worried it will be held accountable for it. We're worried that somebody's going to say, yeah, but 2 weeks ago you told us this and now you're doing this. And I mean, that's true. All of that is true. But I think our credibility is at stake in terms of our motivation and our agenda setting function that we play with our communities. And it's important to figure out what version of this we can be comfortable with. Erica, do you want to talk about this series of posts you guys have done about answering sort of perceived reader questions?
Yeah, and let me back up because we're having some conversations in the chat too, so I want to clue you in.
Oh, good, please. Yeah, I can't see it from this view.
So first of all, Caitlin asked, this is a few minutes ago, but if people think that the boycotts of cable news, the anchors, TV shows, that kind of thing, hurt us in terms of thinking about money and journalism, basically, how those two things come together. And then I kind of went off on a tangent because to me, it makes me crazy when I see TV shows, movies, where there's some journalistic character, right? But they're not the ethical journalists that we all are. Mm-hmm. Even when they're trying to get that right? They make a lot of assumptions about how, even with, pose for this photo, that kind of nonsense. It makes me crazy.
Yeah. Can we talk about Rory Gilmore for a second? Do we have Gilmore Girls fans? Like, seriously?
Yeah, those kinds of things. And Caitlin actually just said that she's thought about doing a series of events on journalism and pop culture, which I absolutely love.
That's such a good idea. I love it.
Yeah. Okay.
What they got wrong.
Right.
Yeah, like perceptions of, here's what you might think. According to this, here's what you might think journalism is or what journalists do. That's great. So get back to that money question. I'm not quite sure I understand. Beth, do you want to jump in?
Chime in.
Or was that Beth who said that, you said?
It was Caitlin.
Oh, Caitlin, do you want to describe yourself?
Sure.
Describe your question?
Sure. I think we've heard a lot about where people are saying people should boycott Laura Ingraham or Anderson Cooper or any of these people for things they've said or the way they've covered it, and then a TV network makes a decision to take them off the air or cuts down their shows, and Bill O'Reilly and like different things like that. And I wonder if those decisions to actually take them off the air because of these boycotts is actually harmful because it says money is driving our journalism decisions.
Yeah. I mean, first of all, we don't have anybody here from cable news. I work a little bit with cable news, and I feel like it's always a slightly different conversation. And there are some challenges there that are unique to what they're doing. The stakes are super, super, super high in a way that is harder for people who work in local journalism to relate to, I think.
But I feel like sometimes that's what most people see all the time. And so
100%.
That's what the public thinks of as media.
That is what the public thinks of. That's what I was just going to say. So when we were doing our user interviews, we dispatched journalists around the country from some national publications and a lot of local publications to interview their own news consumers about how they decide what to trust. And the crazy thing is how many of the interviews ended up talking about Sean Hannity and Rachel Maddow. Even like a local community Texas weekly newspaper, the editor sits down where she has lived forever with one of her readers, and somehow the topic of trust in journalism comes up, and they're no longer talking about their relationship. They're talking about national politics. This happens over and over and over. So for me, like, I can't fix what's happening with cable news. And it actually has very little to do with what you, Caitlin, are doing in your newsroom today. Could hardly be further away from your job, right? Even people who cover national politics, which we do have some in the group, still the decisions you're making day to day are unique to your organization. And so I think that's why we often start first by that idea of differentiating yourself from the media. What is it? What climate do you exist in? And how is what you do especially worthy of trust and credibility? TV news is still the most popular way to get news, and that's for sure true. And I think we do ourselves a disservice if we say, well, that's not us, so I'm not going to worry about it, because us is journalism. Us is what people think of when they think of the news, and being more specific about what we offer has to be a part of our strategy, and it has to be specific to what we do day to day. All right, good question.
Can you
Go ahead, Erica.
I'll actually answer the other one.
Oh, yeah, right, the slide.
Which is actually going to tie into a couple of more comments here. So when we started working with Trusting News, we sat down and we figured, after talking to people, nobody understands how this works, right? How this whole game of journalism works. So we just started telling people, like, if you send us a tip, here's what we do with that. How do we pick stories for the front page? Because like a lot of you were talking about at different times and then the first assignment, you're trying to make decisions about national stories and local stories and how you play them. A lot of times it's different online and in print. Mm-hmm. We tackled this first story, the second headline there, from the print perspective as to how we decide which stories go on the nation world pages in the paper. Because again, it's a very different process online, but how we spotlight them or feature them on our homepage is another conversation that we need to have with our audience, quite honestly. Mm-hmm. And then this last one was, honestly, it was just a really cleverly written column type of approach to it, but how we use anonymous sources and how we vet them and that we know who these people are. We just had a story this last week about a terrible, terrible situation at an elementary school where there's rats and squirrels and mold and all kinds of problems that nobody wants their children involved in. And we had tons of people contact us. And we said in the story that we spoke to these 19 people. They asked to speak to us on condition of anonymity, so that it's clear that we talk to them and it's not just somebody random Twitter post, that kind of thing. We actually know who these people are, what they had to say. We tried to make that very clear, those kinds of things. So Becky had asked a question about thoughts on putting story meetings online or on social media. And I know Beth Trump, they've had a lot of, she's tried to do that, had a lot of pushback. We've talked about that too. Our problem is that we get to a lot of gallows humor into our budget meetings. So I think that would be tough to get everybody to behave. But I think it's a really great idea if the organization is comfortable with it too, as far as that transparency goes. Mm-hmm.
One more thought about anonymous sources. The research actually shows a pretty high percentage of people are confused about how that works, even with the newsrooms, the news products that they consume regularly. And a disturbing number of people thinks that the word anonymous means that the source is anonymous to the journalist. Like we just took somebody's random idea and we don't know who they are and we thought we'd publish it, as opposed to like, no, the reporter and at least 2 editors have to know this, and here are the criteria where we decide it's important enough to do it. Like all those things that we take for granted and that many of us have codified in a policy, like publish the policy, man, publish it, link to it every single time you do it. Let me get through a few more examples here. The Discourse is a really great newsroom we worked with in Canada, and they used their featured story section of Instagram to share an About Us story that was really nice. And I think this should play here. I'm hoping to be able to play it for you. There's no sound, but they basically used an Instagram story to like talk through who they were. Here's who we are. Here's where you can learn about us. They used like the Instagram filters so that it feels natural and authentic to people who are following them there. Here's where our office is and how to contact us. Here's what we believe in and why we're here. Scroll, sign up for the newsletter. Here's a couple of our staff members, kind of a pitch about our value system, diversity, Indigenous perspectives, women-led, if journalists really listened, and here's where to connect with us. I think that is a very simple, and then because of the way Instagram's structured, you can leave that pinned at the top there so anybody can find it. Dallas Point of News had a really, really funny Instagram story that introduced people to was that TikTok actually? They've been having fun with TikTok. But like whatever social platforms you use to communicate or connect with your audience can also be a chance to share some personality about who you are and some things about sort of your brand story and your values and what you stand for and why you exist. Hang on, having trouble advancing the slides here. We did that, thank you. Sorry, hang on a second, there we go. Okay, can I present again? Well, we'll just leave it like that, that's okay. Okay, this is an example. Did I skip? I did, it skipped. Okay, there we go. This is a few different examples of showing, the idea of showing balance. balance often happens over time, right? That like if you're covering an issue, you're going to go deep on different days with different stakeholders in that issue. If you're covering a political race, like you're going to share something specifically about this candidate today and this candidate tomorrow. And we often assume people know that. We assume that people consume a good chunk of what we do. And we assume that they are giving us credit for the fairness that drives our work. So our newsrooms have experimented with some ways to say like, here's one viewpoint and here are some others. Going further than just saying like related stories, because related story can mean anything. Here are a couple examples of where newsrooms have said, like included a paragraph saying like, today's article highlights this. Here are some other viewpoints expressed in previous coverage. Oh, one of these is the News Tribune, Nicole. I think, does that far right one look like you guys? Yep. Sometimes this has happened just in italics at the top of a story. Like we've covered this issue for a while. You know, today's issue brings you this. We've also looked at it from these perspectives. Click here to see all of them. We talk a lot about transparency within stories. This is a box that is now available in the McClatchy CMS, and I'm really excited about it. This can be expanded and contracted within any story in McClatchy. And it basically, they call it a behind our reporting box, but it shows basically, it gives people an opportunity to say, why did we report on this story? Where did the idea come from? What decisions did we make? What policies did we consult? That sort of thing. The trick is figuring out when is the right time to use this and what people actually want to know. Because sometimes when you ask journalists about their work, they're super boring. Like transparency is sometimes really not that interesting. And journalists are like, well, first I went to this meeting and then I called this person and then I read through all these documents in the agenda, and they like chronologically walk you through their entire process. And that's not always interesting. But sometimes the chance to talk, to invite people behind the scenes of a story can be really illuminating. We've done some academic research that shows that this really does enhance credibility. We worked with USA Today and the Tennessean to send 2 different versions of a story to a newsletter list under the guise of research, not like a live story, but we took a story they had already published and people either got a regular version or a version that explained the process of the story. And I don't know if I have the slide here. No, I don't. But on 11 out of 12 factors for trust, they were rated more highly, like accuracy, credibility. People who saw the version of the story with the transparency box, the explain your process box, rated the story more highly. So that's one of the things that would be a good option for you guys to work on. If you think there are things about specific stories that need explaining, this would be a good thing to try to take back to your newsroom. It's one of the options for your final project. Talking about the motivation behind our work is really important. And for those of you struggling with accusations from your communities about political bias or about that sort of gotcha style journalism trying to make people look bad, this is an example from WCPO, which is a TV station in Cincinnati. When they unveiled a project, where they were unveiling a project about police accountability, how cops are held accountable for their actions, they wrote something. They knew enough about their audience to know that they would be perceived as having an anti-cop bias. And so they got in front of it. And along with it, published a story that said, here's why we do this. Like basically, as part of our job, we find out if people in power are being held accountable the same way that regular people like you and I might be. And because they included this message with the rollout of the project, they said they got a lot less pushback than they anticipated. This has happened on a national political level a lot. When David Fahrenthold got a Pulitzer Prize for his reporting on Trump's finances during the campaign, he said that because he shared his process so transparently, especially on Twitter, but because he documented, here's what I want to know, like Trump said he gave this money, I'm looking for evidence, did he actually give that money? Because he shared that so transparently and started with that sort of neutral question, it invited people to see that he wasn't trying to prove Trump wrong. Maybe he was trying to prove him right. He was just looking for evidence. So as journalists, we follow the facts and we collect information and we tell you what we find. And wherever we can share that that is our motivation and say it really clearly, especially around investigations or tough stories like this one, that can be really effective. It's interesting. Here's another example from Tim, who's one of our trust coaches. His newsroom has put this note on some stories. where they thought they might get accused of not being fair. WITF strives to provide nuanced perspectives from the most authoritative sources. We are on the lookout for biases or assumptions in our own work, and we invite you to point out any we may have missed. And that link can go to any email address or feedback form. But the idea that we would say clearly, we want to be fair, we hold each other accountable for biases, for bias creeping into our work, and we invite you to tell us if we could do better. How often do we even stop and invite people to tell us if we could do better? I think that is powerful. And again, it's just a note in italics at the top of the story. I want to see, hang on one second. I'm just going to look and see how much. Oh yeah, good. We're just about done. Okay. Want to make sure we're not running out of time for some questions and chatter here. So this is like a super highlights. The next couple of videos that you can watch on your own time will have more examples you can kind of stop and chew on. Annenberg Media, our other trust coach is Laura Davis, who's at Annenberg Media, and like huge shout out to Laura. She helped us design this class this summer when we kind of decided at the last minute, we should do a class. So big thanks to Laura for that. And her student newsroom at Annenberg Media, as part of their work with us, created a really amazing ethics landing page, and each section of it has an anchor tag so you can link directly to it. It's just a really thorough policy written in very clear language, not like internal language. And I'll show you in a future class how they keep this alive and drive people to it in a way that really highlights its effectiveness a lot. Another thing they've done is behind the scenes videos that I think they do them primarily on Instagram, but then also upload them to YouTube so that they can save them there. But explaining tough decisions. This is one where they covered a suicide on campus and stopped to explain why that's different than what they would usually do, but why in this case they thought it was important. And it's real like low tech. It's just a phone, and the framing and the lighting aren't that good, and it's just like people around the newsroom talking about what they're doing, but it really resonated. Nicole, here's another News Tribune example. I think that reminding people what we stand for and that we're on their side is super important. So I love this News Tribune example, except that I wish fake news were in quotes, because the term fake news drives me crazy and I don't want to reinforce it. But I love that this very powerfully tells people we don't want any part of that. That's not what we do. So I think that's really powerful. And then this example from the Gazette, which is in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, they do a lot of sort of conversation prompts on Facebook, but this is one where they say, as a locally owned news organization, we exist to tell stories of life here. Our only agenda, which I love because readers use the word agenda and viewers use the word agenda a ton, and journalists don't talk about it that much. So I love that they sort of took that word back. Our only agenda is to provide accurate, useful, and compelling information. With that in mind, we're listening, what local stories do you want to see more of? And they reported that they got a ton more useful story ideas with this conversation prompt than they would, than they typically would, in which like the comments, if they hadn't highlighted being local, the comments probably would have devolved into, fake news complaints. So I just want to talk, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I really want to see you guys. There everybody is, hello. Except a lot of you are turned your video off probably so you can eat lunch while we talk, which is totally fine. So hi, now I can see you again. This is more fun. I really would like to answer questions you guys have about anything you saw. Let's start there. Is there anything else you want to follow up on, since I didn't give you a lot of time to breathe as I was speeding through examples, or questions you have about class in general? Is there anything you saw there particularly that already has like inspired you to take it back to your newsroom?
I had a question, Joy.
Yeah.
I was wondering how we keep this from falling on one person, like the person taking the course, and how do we kind of convince reporters and editors who feel they're already overworked that the time listening to readers and honestly their complaints might be well spent?
Such a good question. The challenge of having it fall to one person is so real. And we face that a lot in the newsrooms we work with. I mean, the key to and we're going to talk, especially in our last class, about like organizational change and how you get these ideas to take hold as you come up with a plan. I mean, the key is usually to start by just finding an ally or two, somebody else who you think this solves a problem for, or who likes to look at reader feedback. You're never going to catch everybody. but you're absolutely right that you don't want it all to be on your shoulders or things can fall apart. So I think coming up, that's why as you think about a plan, I really want to encourage you to think about something that will help solve problems for other people, not just you, and that you think you can get buy-in for. We hear from editors all the time that what we're like, my partner Lynn Walsh and I, and she's not going to be super involved in this class, but she's comes from a TV background and is based in San Diego. We were doing a workshop in New Orleans this fall, and we like stopped partway through and said to this room of like top editors, is there any reason this stuff won't work? Like, do you want to push back? Are we giving you suggestions that you don't think are valid? And they were like, no, it's just a matter of time and priorities. So it's about solving. That's why we focus on solving problems. Where do you see that you're losing audience, that you're not serving people well, that you're accidentally losing trust, carelessly losing trust because you're not explaining yourself and you're letting people's misconceptions drive public perception of your work, that you're ceding the conversation to the people who like to complain about you instead of like standing up for yourself. So think through what problems your newsroom is most facing and structure your work with this class around that. And if you would like us to help further with your newsroom, we do that as well. So we're here for you. So the way this class will work is that everything you're doing leads up to a final project or pitch. I pasted in the Slack today a link to, I just this morning recorded like a 4-minute video that was about that final project, like what your options are. But basically next Friday, you're going to turn in some trust goals based on what we've done so far and the feedback you got on what you turned in this week. What do you most want to tackle? And let's chew on that for a little bit. And then 2 weeks later, you're going to turn in an outline for what you most want to accomplish. And in that time, you're going to have a chance to schedule a chat of like a phone call with one of the instructors. And you can work with your partner. If you've had trouble connecting with your partner, let me know and we'll figure that out. But in general, so you turn in trust goals, then you have 2 weeks to come up with a pitch or a plan, and the audience for that is us. Like, tell us what you want to do and let us poke holes in it and make it better. And then after the class ends, you turn in an actual pitch or a plan. That could be a slide deck or an email or memo, like whether it's something for your direct reports if you're a boss, or whether it's something that you want to pitch to your boss or your colleagues or your team. You're going to leave here with something ready to go back and say, here's what problem this solves. Here's what I propose doing. Here's why it's worth it. And here's what pushback I anticipate I might get and how I can be ready for it. So questions about that? Awesome. So we don't see you actually live again for a few weeks. We try to do a couple recorded sessions because I know how hard it is to carve out a specific hour on your schedule. We're available anytime. We will on Slack over the next few weeks share some links to things you might find interesting. We'll have some like questions for you, discussion prompts, so that we can help support each other and talk things through. So do participate in those as you have time. And we will each week share, so next Friday we'll share a link to the video for that next session, and you should watch it before the next week's video is available. And we'll just be in touch on your Google Doc and on Slack as you make progress and decide what you want to focus on. Yay, so happy Friday, everybody. Great to see you. I'll hang out here for a minute in case you just want to ask a question not in front of everybody, which is fine as well. And otherwise, I will see you on Slack. Bye, thanks for being here. Yay, people are learning. That makes me happy. Cool. What's up? I'm going to stop the recording.